March 2016 is the clearest hinge in the story. The month when a private argument that had been tightening like a tourniquet finally became a visible scar. I can still see the light that afternoon. A reluctant, thin sun pushing through the kitchen blinds, turning the dust into slow, apologetic motes. The conflict did not arrive as a single thunderclap. It was a crescendo of small betrayals, missed obligations, and promises eroded by habit. What changed in March 2016 was the realization that this was no longer merely a private inconvenience to be endured. Its costs had become measurable, and it demanded a new kind of reckoning. That realization did not happen overnight. It came through a succession of practical shocks, overdrawn accounts, unsettled bills, conversations that looped without resolution, each one a small nail in the box that held our old assumptions at the time. The larger world felt precarious in ways that echoed what I was discovering at home in the larger sweep of the 2010s. Many people were learning to monetize skills, to stitch together income from odd jobs and online platforms. That context did not explain my family's choices, but it did shape the tools I had available for response. Spring 2016 found me taking a small, practical step, a side job. I treated it then as a temporary lifeline, something to keep the lights on and food on the table. I could not have imagined how that lifeline would grow, or how central those incremental hours would become to remaking a life. In December 2016, I began therapy. I remember the precise decision. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. I did not sit in that chair expecting miracles or a single scene of catharsis. There were no cinematic revelations waiting in the wings. What I sought was scaffolding, an institutional permission to practice new habits while learning to live in the aftermath. The therapist's office smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil. The city outside provided a low, steady hum that felt like the ambient noise of the decade. Sessions in that first winter were quiet and awkward at times. We did inventories of hurt and misattended expectations. The work asked for labor, record-keeping, decisions, accountability. It did not ask for sentiment from the beginning. Honesty in therapy took a practical form. I started keeping records of conversations and money exchanged. I set appointments and scheduled meetings instead of relying on vague goodwill. I learned to translate recurring hurts into policies rather than letting them calcify into a corrosive domestic habit. The lists I made, names, amounts, dates, felt both brutal and liberating. They turned memory into evidence, diffused grievance into defined terms. I wrote down what had happened, and then, as if drafting instructions for how I would live from that point on, I wrote rules I would follow going forward. Those records and rules met reality quickly. The financial crisis that followed the split felt catastrophic at first, but it also revealed a resourcefulness I had not known I possessed. In the spring of 2016, the side job I took to bridge a gap began, almost imperceptibly, to gain steadiness. What was a stopgap turned over the next 2 years into more reliable work, and by the end of 2018 it had evolved into a small business. Friends helped me build an online store. What began as scattershot effort, product photos taken on an old phone, listings typed at the kitchen island, grew more organized. Inventory systems were cobbled together, tax paperwork learned the hard way, postage rates negotiated. Growth was slow at first. Then, with a steadiness that surprised me, it gathered momentum. The steadiness of earned income taught me a different kind of confidence, the capacity to meet an unexpected bill without turning to a parental safety net, the ability to plan beyond the next week. This development was not exceptional for the era. The gig economy and the democratization of commerce through platforms and social media turned many domestic experiments into small enterprises, but the context is important because it framed the choices I could make in an era that encouraged us to monetize everything. What I built remained deeply personal. It became a means to rewrite the relationship with my family on terms I could live with. With predictable income came the breathing room to insist on clarity, a shared spreadsheet for significant expenses, a calendar for visits, an agreed threshold for when financial aid might be offered. These were clumsy and domestic instruments, but they were necessary. They shifted conversations about money from emotional terrain into administrative practice. The testing ground for those new rules was often the holidays. Once sprawling rituals steeped in obligatory cheer, the holidays became weak, long experiments in what our family could sustain. By Christmas 2017 and Thanksgiving 2018, the rituals had shrunk and simplified. The house that had once been a stage for theatrical conviviality now felt smaller, more honest. We stopped pretending the house and the people in it were other than they were. That meant accepting thoughtful pauses at the table instead of forcing empty chatter. Sometimes it meant leaving early to preserve the fragile calm I had fought to build. Those choices were not always understood. At a family reunion in July 2019, a cousin told me I was being dramatic for refusing to just move on. He spoke as if moving on were a public duty rather than a personal process. He did not understand that moving on is often a kind of privilege. Sometimes the moral labor of carrying the consequences of what happened is necessary precisely so you do not repeat it. What happened between 2016 and 2018 was as much ethical recalibration as it was financial. I wanted my parents to understand that their mistake had consequences, financial, emotional, temporal. while also ensuring they would be cared for as they aged. Balancing those truths demanded a ledger that measured more than dollars. In the months after starting therapy, I developed moral lists: things forgiven and things remembered, distinctions between apology and restitution, the difference between contrition and a promise to do better. These were not elegant lists. They were patchwork rules that helped me decide when to help, when to say no, and when to insist on a repair plan rather than a quick-fix payment. I learned I could accept an apology without erasing memory. I could offer care without slipping back into unconditional supply. That pattern that had enabled earlier hurt. Rebuilding trust with my sister was granular, ordinary work that unfolded over months rather than as a single, sweeping gesture from late 2016 into 2018. We began testing new patterns: planned, accounted for shared meals, a text about a concert offered as an olive branch rather than an expectation, a phone call about a minor family detail that was really just checking in. On the worst days, the old fissure yawned open under pressure. On the best days, she surprised me with small thoughtfulnesses that suggested remorse had altered how she moved through the world. I did not forgive entirely for her sake. I forgave to free myself from the energy of perpetual grievance. That decision felt both radical and practical. It allowed me to show up to life without carrying my history like armor. Those domestic recalibrations rippled outward into how I imagined any future family I might form. Watching friends in the late 2010s argue about finances and negotiate roles taught me to think differently about parenting. The importance of checking facts and feelings, of distinguishing love from duty. I began sketching, in quiet hours, what a family covenant might look like. Not a romantic vow, but a set of practices. Humility to test assumptions and courage to own mistakes when they failed us. The covenant, I came to see, was less a vow of permanent trust than a series of practices. Upheld by ordinary habits, it is easier to demand fidelity to an idealized image of family than to practice fidelity to the ongoing project of being better people to one another. The latter requires a willingness to be tested by daily facts: bills, illnesses, petty slights, small kindnesses. These mundane encounters reveal character. The call you make at midnight because someone is in trouble. The repair you insist on before handing over money. The second, patient walk you take with a relative who cannot yet see how they hurt you. Being cut off taught me that family is not a single, clean thing. It is a network of debts and gifts, betrayals and apologies, duties and refusals. It is peculiarly patient and stubborn in its capacity to hold contradictions. The cut left a scar, but that scar had an honesty nostalgia often tries to varnish over. It reminded me, whenever memory softened into sweetness, that warmth is not an argument against accountability. It also reminded me that people can change, not through sudden revelations, but through slow, awkward choices that, cumulatively, amount to repair. I do not pretend the story is finished. Old habits surface. I still question whether I did the right thing when I set boundaries that sometimes felt severe. I still get angry remembering what it cost me, but I also have a life I built because I had to. Friends who are family by choice, a career that responds to my effort rather than my lineage, a sense of competence that does not depend on anyone else's belief. Those are the things I carry when I walk into the room where my parents wait. We do not pretend the roof has not leaked. Instead, we keep a bucket under the drip and gradually decide whether to repair it or build anew. That fragile equilibrium was tested again late in 2019, when Dad was hospitalized. Hospital rooms, with their fluorescent lights, interrupted sleep cycles, and a strange collapse of time, compress a family's problems into a manageable if brutal space. They feel too small for everything that has to be decided: medications, visiting hours, insurance forms. On the day I sat in Dad's room, the clock moved in quarter-hour increments, each slice feeling like a miniature judgment. After discharge papers were signed in December 2019, home care began. What had been condensed into the hospital now stretched back out across weeks and months, allowing old patterns to reassert themselves and giving room for the quiet work of living. Daily transfers, medication schedules, check-ins, to reveal what our new rules could withstand. Dad's recovery was not dramatic. It was a series of small, stubborn returns. One day he could walk a few more steps. Another day he told a joke he had remembered. Another day went by without dizziness. There were also nights when Mom called me in a panic because he had fallen or a new symptom had made them both afraid in ways that had nothing to do with blame and everything to do with the uncertain arithmetic of becoming older. Those calls tested the rules we had invented. They tested my patience, my purse, and the steadiness of the boundaries I had been cultivating. One moment stands out with the clarity of small domestic theater. A late afternoon at their kitchen table in January 2020, a spreadsheet glowed on my laptop, listing the agreed thresholds for financial help. An equally important list named who would do what, and when 2 cups of tea had gone cold in their saucers, the furnace hummed with a tired, intermittent complaint. Mom told a story about a leaky furnace and the cost to replace it for a few heartbeats. I felt the old script, the immediate urge to erase inconvenience with money, to be the child who rescued parents who had once refused me. I closed the laptop and said, with the firmness therapy had taught me, we can contribute a set amount toward repairs, We can research grants and cheaper contractors. We can put it on the shared calendar so someone is accountable for every call. I would not co-sign a loan. I would not underwrite an open-ended renovation. My mother's face, relief braided with disappointment, told me that boundaries can feel like cold water to someone who wants warmth. Without accounting, my sister's behavior did not resolve neatly into lines of right and wrong over 2019 and into 2020. She began, at the therapist's suggestion, to attend classes, anger management, and then a neighborhood support group for people rebuilding trust. She made small financial gestures, paying off part of a credit card, contributing to hospital parking, bringing takeout that kept dinners easy. Once she left a simple note acknowledging harm and asking, softly, for time. I accepted those gestures on their terms. I did not allow them to eclipse memory, but I let them become facts in the ledger. There were days when I worried I was gullible and days when I was grateful to see someone do the slow, unattractive work of making amends. Therapy worked quietly at the edges of all of this. Session by session, it taught me to separate care from absolution. I could buy Dad the crossword book he liked without signaling that the past was erased. I could sit with him at a cardiology appointment and be present without pretending his earlier choices had not changed my life. Sessions taught me to name limits plainly. I can help with transportation 3 times a month, and to treat those declarations as moral acts rather than punishments. Boundaries, I discovered, are a form of generosity. They preserve the possibility of future care by refusing to allow present needs to become leverage for coercion. Extended family reacted in mixed ways. As families often do, some relatives who were impatient when the cutoff happened reached out with condolences and offers of help. Once the concrete challenges of aging were visible, others retreated into positions they had staked out before, siding with the more appealing story or avoiding the work of distinguishing loyalty from enablement. At a small family gathering in the spring of 2020, a cousin again asked why I insisted on making a fuss about paperwork. I told him, calmly, that I was not making a fuss. I was trying to keep us from repeating a costly mistake. He folded his arms and changed the subject. It is curious how some people prefer the drama of righteous offense to the slow, mundane labor of getting things in order. Practicalities accumulated in ways that felt both bureaucratic and intimate. Medical directives were signed in March 2020. A conversation about powers of attorney took place in June 2020. After long arguments about what a trust looked like in legal language, we settled on an administrative structure. By late 2020, I accepted an administrative role with conditions that felt like reasonable safeguards rather than tests of character. Consultation with a neutral physician for ambiguous medical decisions, a small committee to approve major transactions, and a clause to revisit the arrangement yearly. That structure was not coldness. It was an attempt to codify lessons so that the impulse which once allowed my parents to cut me off could not be turned again into unaccountable pressure. They were hesitant at first. Guilt is persuasive, but they accepted the paperwork because it meant competent decisions when competence mattered. Financial steadiness, achieved incrementally between 2017 and 2020, changed the tenor of almost everything. The side gigs evolution into a small business gave me breathing room. I could rent a cleaner for a month, buy a replacement mattress, or book the physical therapist the hospital recommended without the frantic arithmetic that used to make my chest tighten. Those were modest freedoms, but they were real and they mattered. They changed my posture toward my parents from defensive to generous in ways that did not require forgiving on someone else's schedule. Anger still surfaced with surprising clarity. A morning request could have me replaying the original betrayal by noon. How dismissal had felt, how much trust had been squandered, the costs I had borne alone. When that happened, I used the tools therapy had given me. Acknowledge the anger without letting it command the conversation, set a limit, and offer an alternative. Sometimes others call that procedural. I call it sanity. It is the labor of refusing to be drawn into